I'm a night shift security guard, which is why I didn't think twice about spending a weekend alone at my uncle's ice fishing cabin in northern Minnesota. What I found frozen in the lake still makes me check my locks twice every night. This happened in January of 2023. My uncle had been letting me use his cabin for years during the winter months. It's about 2 hours north of Duluth, right on the edge of Lake Vermilion. The place is pretty isolated. The nearest neighbor is maybe 3 miles down a logging road, and cell service is basically non-existent unless you drive into town. I arrived on a Friday evening around 6 p.m. The sun was already setting, painting the frozen lake this eerie orange color. The temperature was sitting at around -15 degrees, cold enough that the inside of my nose froze when I breathed in. I unloaded my gear from my Ford Ranger and got the wood stove going inside the cabin. My plan was simple: fish during the day, read at night, and enjoy the silence I never get working security at a 24-hour warehouse. The cabin is small, just one room with a loft bed, a wood stove, and a couple of windows overlooking the lake. My uncle keeps his ice fishing equipment in a shed out back: augers, tip-ups, jigging rods, the usual stuff. There's no running water, just a well pump outside and an outhouse about 30 feet from the main building. It's primitive, but that's part of the appeal. That first night was uneventful. I made dinner on the propane stove, had a few beers, and fell asleep to the sound of the wind howling across the frozen lake. The ice makes these sounds at night, like groaning or cracking, which is totally normal. It's just the ice expanding and contracting with the temperature changes. I'd heard it 100 times before. Saturday morning, I woke up around 7 a.m. to about 6 inches of fresh snow that had fallen overnight. I made coffee and bundled up in my insulated bibs and parka before heading out to drill some holes in the ice. The lake was covered in about 3 feet of solid ice, more than safe enough to walk on. You need at least 4 inches to be safe, and we had way more than that. I set up about 200 yards from shore, drilling 6 holes in a line with my hand auger. The ice fishing was slow, but I didn't mind. The isolation was exactly what I needed after working nights for months straight, dealing with homeless people trying to sleep in the warehouse and tweakers attempting to break into the loading docks. I caught a couple of small perch in the first few hours, nothing worth keeping. Around noon, I decided to drill a few more holes further out on the lake, where the water was deeper. My uncle always said the bigger fish stayed in the deep zones during winter. That's when I noticed something weird. There was already a hole drilled in the ice about 50 feet from my setup. The snow around it had been cleared away recently, maybe within the last day or two based on the lack of snow accumulation. I walked over to check it out, thinking maybe another fisherman had been out here yesterday. But as I got closer, my stomach dropped. The hole was much larger than a standard ice fishing hole. It was probably 3 feet in diameter, big enough for a person to fit through. Someone had used a chainsaw to cut it based on the marks in the ice. Nobody uses a chainsaw for ice fishing. An auger makes a perfect circle, clean and efficient. A chainsaw is messy, dangerous, and completely unnecessary. I knelt down and looked into the hole. The water below was completely black, and I couldn't see the bottom even with my headlamp. The edges of the hole were starting to refreeze, which meant it had been cut sometime in the last 24 hours. The ice around here refreezes fast in these temperatures. But what really disturbed me was what I found next to the hole. There were frozen drops of blood in the snow, leading from the hole back toward the shore in the direction of my cabin. Not a lot of blood, but enough to make me uncomfortable, maybe 10 or 15 drops scattered over a 20-foot area. I tried to convince myself it was from a fish. Maybe someone had caught something big and dragged it back to shore. Pike can bleed a lot if you're not careful with them, but something about the pattern didn't look right. The drops were too scattered, too random. I followed the blood trail across the lake. My boots crunched in the snow, and I kept looking around, suddenly very aware of how alone I was out here. The blood trail led directly to the shed behind my uncle's cabin. The shed door was slightly ajar, which was strange because I distinctly remembered closing it the night before. I always close doors, it's a habit from my security job. I pulled the door open slowly and looked inside. Everything appeared normal at first glance. The fishing equipment was right where it should be. Rods hanging on the wall, tackle boxes stacked in the corner, the old propane heater my uncle used when he worked on projects out here. Then I noticed the chainsaw. It was sitting on the workbench, and there were ice shavings on the blade and scattered on the floor around it. My uncle never used a chainsaw for ice fishing. He always used an auger like everyone else. The chainsaw was typically used for cutting firewood, and it was usually stored hanging on the wall, not sitting out on the bench. I picked up the chainsaw and examined it closer. The blade was still damp, and there were dark stains on the metal that definitely weren't from cutting ice or wood. The stains had that distinctive dark red color that I recognized from my years working security. I'd seen enough incidents to know what dried blood looked like. My hands started shaking. I set the chainsaw down and backed out of the shed. I looked around the property, scanning the tree line, suddenly feeling like I was being watched. The forest was completely silent except for the wind. No birds, no animals, nothing. I immediately went back inside the cabin and locked the door. I tried my phone, no service as expected. The nearest cell tower was 15 miles away in town. I had a CB radio in my truck, but I'd need to drive at least 5 miles down the logging road to reach anyone, and I wasn't sure I wanted to leave the cabin unattended. I decided I would pack up and leave first thing in the morning. Something about this whole situation felt wrong, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out what was going on. I spent the afternoon boarding up the cabin, bringing in extra firewood, and trying to distract myself by reading. But I couldn't focus. Every few minutes I'd look out the window at the lake, at that hole someone had chainsawed into the ice. What were they using it for? Why was there blood? And why had they used my uncle's equipment? That night, I barely slept. I kept the wood stove burning hot and stayed in my winter gear, just in case I needed to make a run for my truck. Every sound outside made me jump, the ice cracking, the wind rattling the windows, branches scraping against the cabin roof. Around 2 a.m. I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was the sound of a vehicle driving on the ice. I knew that sound well from years of ice fishing. When trucks drive on frozen lakes, they make this specific crunching sound as the tires break through the top layer of snow. Someone was out on the lake. I got out of bed and moved to the window, staying in the shadows so I wouldn't be visible. In the moonlight, I could see a dark pickup truck driving slowly across the ice, heading toward the large hole I had found earlier. It was an older model, maybe from the 90s, with a rusted body and no plates that I could see from this distance. The truck stopped right next to the hole, and I watched as the driver's door opened. A person got out. I couldn't tell if it was a man or woman from this distance, but they were tall and wearing dark clothing. They stood there for a moment, looking around, and I instinctively ducked away from the window, even though I was sure they couldn't see me. The person walked to the back of the truck and lowered the tailgate. They reached into the truck bed and appeared to be pulling something out. It was large and wrapped in what looked like a dark tarp or heavy blanket. They struggled with it for a moment, and I could see their breath forming clouds in the freezing air. They dragged whatever it was to the edge of the hole. It was heavy. They were pulling it across the ice, leaving a drag mark in the snow. When they reached the hole, they knelt down and seemed to be unwrapping something, though I couldn't see details from my position in the cabin. Then I watched in horror as they pushed it into the water. There was a splash, barely audible from this distance, and then nothing. The person stood there for a moment, looking down into the hole. Then they walked back to their truck, climbed in, and drove off toward the far shore, disappearing into the tree line on the opposite side of the lake. The whole thing took maybe 5 minutes. I stood at the window shaking, not from the cold but from what I had just witnessed. Someone had just dumped something or someone into the lake through that hole, and they had done it in the middle of the night when they thought no one would see. I grabbed my uncle's rifle from the closet. It's a Remington 700, 308 caliber, and I made sure it was loaded. I sat in the corner of the cabin with my back to the wall, keeping the rifle pointed at the door. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every few minutes I'd peek out the window, expecting to see the truck coming back, expecting to see someone walking toward the cabin, but nothing happened. The lake remained silent and empty. The rest of the night was the longest of my life. I couldn't shake the image of that wrapped bundle being pushed into the frozen lake. What was inside? Who was it? And how many times had they done this before? As soon as the sun came up around 7:30 a.m., I threw all my gear in my truck as fast as I could. I didn't bother cleaning up the cabin or putting things away properly. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I drove straight to the sheriff's office in town, about 25 miles away. The roads were icy, and I nearly slid into a ditch twice, but I didn't care. I just needed to tell someone what I had seen. The deputy who took my statement was a guy in his 50s named Carl. He looked skeptical at first, probably thinking I was just some city guy who'd gotten spooked by being alone in the woods. But as I described everything, the chainsaw, the blood, the hole in the ice, the truck in the middle of the night, his expression changed. He said they'd send someone out to check the cabin and the lake. I gave them the exact location of the hole and described the truck I had seen as best I could. Dark color, older model, rusted body, no visible plates. It wasn't much to go on. 2 days later, a detective called me. His name was Detective Morrison, and he sounded tired. They had found the hole and confirmed someone had used a chainsaw to cut it. They also found the blood trail and tested it. It was human blood, type O positive. They were organizing a dive team to search the lake, but he warned me it might not lead anywhere. The water under the ice was over 100 feet deep in that area, and visibility was nearly zero. Even with professional divers, finding something in those conditions would be like finding a needle in a haystack. And that's assuming whatever was dumped hadn't been weighted down and sunk to the bottom. They searched for 3 days. They never found anything in the water. They also never identified who had been using my uncle's cabin or shed. The chainsaw had been wiped clean of prints. Detective Morrison told me they suspected someone had been using the remote location for illegal activities, but without finding what was dumped in the lake or identifying the person, they couldn't pursue it further. The case went cold within a month. Morrison said they'd keep it open, but realistically, without evidence or witnesses, there wasn't much they could do. He advised me to stay away from the cabin for a while, just to be safe. My uncle sold the cabin 6 months later. He said he didn't want the property anymore after what happened, and honestly, I didn't blame him. The place had always been our family's retreat, but now it was tainted. Every time he looked at it, he'd think about what I had seen. I never went ice fishing again. Every time I see a frozen lake now, I think about what might be resting at the bottom, waiting for the spring thaw. I think about that person in the dark truck, calmly disposing of something in the middle of the night like they'd done it 100 times before. The worst part is knowing that someone is still out there, someone who knows how to dispose of things where they'll never be found, someone who used my uncle's property and equipment like they owned the place. And sometimes late at night, I wonder if they saw me watching from the cabin window. I wonder if they know who I am. I still work night shifts at the warehouse, but now I keep my uncle's rifle in my truck, just in case, and I never stay anywhere isolated anymore. I learned my lesson about being alone in the middle of nowhere. Some people say I should have done more, that I should have gone out on the ice that night and confronted whoever it was, but I know better. I've worked security long enough to know that confronting dangerous people in isolated locations is a good way to end up at the bottom of a frozen lake yourself. I reported what I saw, I did everything I could, and sometimes that has to be enough. I'm a freelance graphic designer who works from home, which is why I was the only person on my street when the blizzard hit. The man who knocked on my door during the storm knew things about me he shouldn't have known. This happened in February of 2024 inches upstate New York, just outside of Syracuse. I live in a small ranch house on a dead-end street with maybe 8 other houses. Most of my neighbors are older folks or families with kids. I'd lived there for about 3 years, mostly keeping to myself. The weather forecast that week had been warning about a major winter storm. They were calling it a once-in-a-decade blizzard, predicting 30 inches of snow and wind gusts up to 60 miles per hour. The governor had declared a state of emergency and was urging people to stay off the roads. By Tuesday afternoon, most of my neighbors had either left to stay with family or stocked up and hunkered down. I watched from my window as the Hendersons next door loaded their kids into their SUV and drove off to stay with relatives in Pennsylvania. The Chens across the street did the same thing. By 5 p.m. I counted only 2 other houses on my street with lights on. I wasn't worried. I work from home full-time, had plenty of food, and my house has a backup generator in case the power went out. I actually enjoy being snowed in. It gives me an excuse to avoid social obligations and focus on my design work. The snow started falling around 7 p.m. At first it was light, almost peaceful. I made myself dinner and settled in to work on a logo design for a client. By 9 p.m., the snow was coming down hard. I could barely see the streetlight at the end of my driveway. The wind was howling, rattling my windows. Around 10:30 p.m., my power went out. The whole street went dark. I waited a few minutes to see if it would come back on, but nothing happened. I went down to my basement and fired up the generator. It kicked on immediately and my lights came back. I only run essential things when I'm on generator power: heat, refrigerator, a few lights, and my computer. I went back upstairs and looked out my front window. The entire street was pitch black except for my house. Apparently, I was the only one with a generator running. The snow was already at least a foot deep, and it was still coming down heavy. That's when I saw the footprints. Fresh footprints in the snow, leading from the sidewalk up to my front porch. They stopped right at my door and then led back down to the sidewalk, disappearing into the darkness. My heart started pounding. Someone had just been on my porch. I moved to the window and looked out carefully, but I couldn't see anyone. The visibility was terrible with the snow blowing everywhere. I checked my phone to see if I had any notifications from my doorbell camera, but my Wi-Fi was down. The camera runs on Wi-Fi, so it was useless. I made a mental note to get one with local storage. I stood there for a few minutes, watching, but nothing happened. Maybe it was one of my neighbors checking to see if anyone was home, but why wouldn't they knock? And why would they be walking around in a blizzard? I tried to calm myself down. I double-checked that my front door was locked, then went around and checked all my windows. Everything was secure. I decided to just ignore it and get back to work. But I couldn't focus. I kept thinking about those footprints, about someone standing on my porch in the middle of a blizzard. I finally gave up on work around midnight and decided to watch some TV to distract myself. That's when I heard it. 3 loud knocks on my front door. Slow, deliberate knocks. I froze. My house was the only one with lights on. Of course someone would knock here if they needed help, but something about it felt wrong. The way the person had been on my porch earlier without knocking, and now this. I walked to the door but didn't open it. "Who is it?" I called out. "I need help." It was a man's voice, muffled by the wind. "Sorry, my phone's not working," I lied. "The cell towers are down." There was a pause. Then the man said, "That's okay, Jessica. I just need to come inside and warm up for a bit." My blood ran cold. He had used my name. How did he know my name? "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I'm your neighbor from down the street," he said. "We've met before." I didn't recognize his voice, and I definitely didn't remember any neighbors who would know my name. I barely talked to anyone on this street. "Which house?" I asked. Another pause. "The blue one, number 47. There was no blue house at number 47. That address didn't even exist on my street. Our street only went up to number 39. "I think you have the wrong street," I said, backing away from the door. "I can't help you." "Come on, Jessica, I know you're alone in there. I saw the Hendersons leave. I saw the Chens leave. Everyone left except you." His voice was different now, less friendly, more insistent. "Leave or I'm calling the police," I said. He laughed. It was a low, unsettling sound. "No, you're not. Your phone's not working, remember?" I ran to my kitchen and grabbed my phone, ready to dial 911. But when I looked at the screen, I had no signal. The storm must have knocked out the cell towers. I tried anyway, but the call wouldn't connect. I went back to the living room and peeked through the curtains. The man was still standing on my porch. He was tall, wearing a dark winter coat and a ski mask. He wasn't moving, just standing there facing my door. Then he spoke again, louder this time. "I like your design work, Jessica, especially that logo you did for the coffee company last month. Very creative." My stomach dropped. How did he know about my client work? That information wasn't public. It was under NDA. "I've been watching you work through your window," he continued. "You sit at that desk every day, completely unaware. Sometimes you work late into the night, always alone." I felt sick. This man had been watching me. For how long? Days, weeks, months? I grabbed a knife from my kitchen and went to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. My bedroom was at the back of the house, away from the front porch. I tried my phone again, still no signal. I could hear him knocking again, harder this time. Then the knocking stopped, and I heard footsteps crunching through the snow around the side of my house. He was walking around my property. I looked out my bedroom window and saw him pass by, checking each window. When he saw me looking, he stopped and waved. Even through the ski mask, I could tell he was smiling. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the knife. I ran back to the living room and checked the front door again. It was still locked. But then I heard something that made my blood freeze. The sound of my basement door opening. I had gone down to start the generator earlier. Had I locked the basement door when I came back up? I couldn't remember. I heard footsteps on my basement stairs. Slow, heavy footsteps. He was inside my house. I didn't think. I just ran. I grabbed my car keys and my winter coat and ran straight out my front door into the blizzard. I didn't even put on boots, I was wearing slippers. The snow was up to my knees, and the wind was so strong I could barely stand. I ran to my car in the driveway and tried to open the door, but it was frozen shut. I could see through my front window that the lights were still on inside my house. I saw a shadow moving past the window. I ran down my driveway to the street, not knowing where I was going. My feet were already numb from the cold. The snow was so thick I could barely see 5 feet in front of me. I ran toward where I thought the main road was, hoping to find help, but the snow was too deep and I was moving too slow. I fell twice, and the second time I struggled to get back up. That's when I saw the headlights. A car was coming down the street, moving slowly through the snow. I ran toward it, waving my arms and screaming. The car stopped, and a woman rolled down her window. It was Mrs. Patterson, one of my neighbors from 2 streets over. She was on her way back from her daughter's house. "Jessica, what are you doing out here?" she asked, looking alarmed. I told her everything as quickly as I could. She immediately called 911 apparently. Her phone still had signal somehow. Then she told me to get in her car. The police arrived about 15 minutes later, which felt like an eternity. 2 officers went to my house with their weapons drawn. Mrs. Patterson and I waited in her car, watching. The officers were inside for maybe 10 minutes. When they came out, they walked over to us. One of them said they had searched the entire house and found no one inside. The basement door was locked from the inside. There was no sign of forced entry anywhere. But they did find something. Fresh, wet footprints in my basement, leading from the door to the stairs. The footprints were large, size 12 or 13 boots. They stopped halfway up the basement stairs and then led back down to the door. The officers asked if I had been in my basement recently. I told them yes, to start the generator, but I was wearing slippers. These were boot prints. They also found something else that made me sick to my stomach. When they checked my back door, they found scratch marks around the lock, like someone had tried to pick it. They said the marks were fresh, probably made within the last hour. The officers took my statement and filed a report. They said they would increase patrols in the area, but realistically, with the blizzard, there wasn't much they could do. They advised me not to stay in the house alone that night. I ended up staying with Mrs. Patterson for 3 days until the storm passed and my neighbors came back. When I finally returned home, I had a security system installed immediately, cameras with local storage, motion sensors, the works. But here's the part that still haunts me. A week after the incident, I got a message on Instagram. It was from an account with no profile picture and no posts. The message said, "Sorry I missed you during the storm, Jessica. Maybe next time." I reported it to the police, but they said there was nothing they could do. Instagram accounts can be made from anywhere, and this one used a VPN that masked the location. The account was deleted within an hour of sending the message. I had the locks changed on every door in my house. I installed motion-activated lights all around my property. I got a German Shepherd named Max who sleeps in my room every night. And I never work with my curtains open anymore. But sometimes, late at night during a snowstorm, I wonder if he's still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment when I'm alone again. I don't know who he was or how he knew so much about me. The police never found any suspects. Detective Martinez, who handled my case, said it's possible the man had been stalking me for weeks, or even months. He could have been anyone, a neighbor, a delivery person, someone who just happened to see me through my window one day and became obsessed. The worst part is not knowing if he's moved on or if he's still out there, waiting for another blizzard, another night when I'm alone and vulnerable. I still live in the same house, but I'm never truly comfortable anymore. Every time there's a winter storm warning, I pack a bag and stay with my sister in the city. I refuse to be alone in that house during a snowstorm ever again, and I never ever open my door after dark anymore, no matter who's knocking. I work as a paramedic, which means I've seen some disturbing things, but nothing prepared me for what I found in that abandoned ski lodge during a search and rescue call. What the hikers had been doing up there still makes me check over my shoulder. This happened in December of 2023 inches, the White Mountains of New Hampshire. I was working for a private ambulance company that contracted with the state for wilderness rescue operations. Basically, when someone got injured or lost in the mountains, we were part of the team that went to get them. The call came in around 4 p.m. on a Saturday. A group of cross-country skiers had found an injured hiker about 3 miles up the Tuckerman Trail. The hiker was hypothermic and couldn't walk. Our team was dispatched along with 2 forest rangers to extract him. It was already getting dark when we headed up the trail. Winter days are short and New Hampshire sunset was at 4:15, and we'd be operating in darkness pretty quickly. The temperature was around 20 degrees, and there was about 2 feet of snow on the ground. Our team consisted of me, my partner Derek, and 2 rangers named Mike and Sarah. We loaded up the rescue sled with medical supplies and started the hike. The trail was steep and icy in sections, which made pulling the sled difficult. We reached the injured hiker around 5:30 p.m. He was in his late 20s, suffering from moderate hypothermia and a sprained ankle. The group of cross-country skiers who found him had done the right thing, wrapped him in emergency blankets and called for help immediately. We got him stabilized and loaded onto the rescue sled. The skiers headed back down the mountain while we prepared for the extraction. That's when one of the rangers, Mike, mentioned something that caught my attention. "There's an old ski lodge about half a mile from here," he said. "It's been abandoned since the 72nds. We could stop there to warm up before we head back down." I'd heard about the lodge before. It was part of a failed ski resort that went bankrupt decades ago. The buildings were still standing, but they were off limits to the public due to safety concerns. However, rangers and rescue teams sometimes used them as emergency shelters. We decided to make the stop. The injured hiker needed to be kept warm, and frankly, we were all exhausted from the climb. The lodge was only a short detour from the main trail. We reached it around 6 p.m. The building was massive, probably 3 stories tall with a huge deck that overlooked the valley. Most of the windows were broken, and the front door was hanging off its hinges. Snow had drifted into the entrance. Mike used his flashlight to check the interior before we went in. "Looks stable enough," he said. "Let's get inside and warm up." We pulled the sled through the entrance and into what used to be the main lobby. There were old couches covered in snow and debris, a stone fireplace that was still intact, and a front desk with the register still sitting on top. Everything was frozen and covered in a thick layer of dust and ice. Derek and I stayed with the injured hiker while Mike and Sarah went to check the rest of the building. We had maybe 30 minutes before we needed to start the trek back down. I gave the hiker some warm fluids and checked his vitals. He was doing okay, just shaken up and embarrassed about needing rescue. That's when I heard Sarah yell from somewhere deeper in the building. It wasn't a scream exactly, more like a sharp shout of surprise. "Mike, Derek, you need to see this." Derek and I exchanged glances. We told the hiker to stay put, and we followed Sarah's voice through a hallway past the lobby. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating old ski equipment hanging on the walls, and faded posters advertising lift tickets from 1972. We found Sarah and Mike in what looked like an old dining hall. There were long tables arranged in rows, and a commercial kitchen visible through a doorway at the far end. But that's not what made Sarah yell. On one of the tables, there were fresh supplies. Not old, dusty supplies from the 70s, fresh supplies. There were water bottles, protein bars, a propane camping stove, and sleeping bags. All of it looked brand new, maybe purchased within the last few months. Someone had been using this place. "Squatters?" Derek suggested. "Maybe," Mike said, but he didn't sound convinced. "But why would anyone camp out here in the middle of winter? There's no heat, no running water." Sarah was examining the sleeping bags. "There are 4 of them," she said. "All laid out like someone's been sleeping here recently." I walked over to the kitchen and shined my flashlight inside. There were dirty dishes in the sink, paper plates, and plastic utensils. There was also a trash bag in the corner, filled with empty food containers. I bent down to look closer, and that's when I noticed something strange. All of the food containers were from expensive organic brands. This wasn't the kind of stuff you'd expect homeless people or squatters to have. These were $15 packages of freeze-dried meals from outdoor specialty stores. "Guys," I said, "I think whoever's staying here has money." That's when we heard it, the sound of voices outside. Multiple voices, getting closer. We all froze. Mike immediately turned off his flashlight and gestured for us to do the same. We stood in complete darkness, listening. The voices were clearer now. It sounded like 4 or 5 people, all male, talking and laughing. They were speaking English, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. They sounded young, maybe in their 20s or 30s. "We need to leave," Mike whispered. "Now." We quickly made our way back to the lobby where the injured hiker was waiting. He looked confused when he saw our faces. "What's wrong?" he asked. "We need to go," I said quietly. "Right now." We had just grabbed the sled handles when the front door burst open. 5 men walked in, all wearing expensive winter gear, the kind you see in outdoor magazines. They were carrying backpacks and what looked like camera equipment. They stopped when they saw us. For a moment, nobody said anything. Then one of them, a tall guy with a beard, smiled. "Hey there, you folks lost?" Mike stepped forward, putting on his professional ranger voice. "We're with Mountain Rescue. We're extracting an injured hiker. Didn't mean to intrude on your camp." The bearded guy's smile didn't waver. "No worries at all. We're just up here doing some winter camping. You know, getting away from civilization for a bit." Something about his tone made my skin crawl. Nobody goes winter camping in an abandoned building unless they're hiding from something. "Well, we'll get out of your way," Mike said, already starting to pull the sled toward the door. But the bearded guy didn't move. He just stood there, blocking the exit, still smiling. The other 4 men had spread out around the lobby, almost like they were surrounding us. "You didn't see anything in the dining hall, did you?" the bearded guy asked. His smile was gone now. "No," Mike lied, "just passing through." The guy studied us for a long moment. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Derek's hand had moved to his belt where he kept a folding knife. Finally, the bearded guy stepped aside. "Safe travels," he said. We practically ran out of that lodge. We pulled the sled as fast as we could back to the main trail, not stopping until we were at least a quarter mile away. None of us spoke during the entire descent. We just wanted to get off that mountain. We made it back to the trailhead around 8 p.m. and loaded the injured hiker into the ambulance. Once we were safely in the vehicle with the doors locked, Mike finally spoke. "We need to report this to the state police," he said. "Report what?" Derek asked. "Some guys winter camping in an abandoned building." "It didn't feel right," Sarah said. "The way they surrounded us, the way that guy asked if we'd seen anything." Mike nodded. "I'm calling it in." He made the call from the trailhead parking lot while Derek and I transported the injured hiker to the hospital. I gave my statement to the police the next day, describing everything we'd seen, the fresh supplies, the expensive equipment, the 5 men who'd confronted us. 2 days later, Detective Williams from the state police called me. They'd sent a team up to the lodge to investigate. What they found made everything make sense in the worst possible way. The lodge wasn't being used for camping. It was being used as a base of operations for illegal hunting. The 5 men were part of a poaching ring that had been operating in the White Mountains for at least 2 years. They were hunting protected species including endangered lynx and selling the pelts on the black market. In the basement of the lodge, police found dozens of animal pelts, hunting equipment, and documentation of their sales. They also found something that made me feel sick. There were photos pinned to a wall, photos of hikers, skiers, and other people who'd apparently stumbled across the lodge. There was a photo of our rescue team. Someone had taken it while we were inside the lodge, probably with a trail camera they had set up outside. Below the photo, someone had written our names. They had identified all 4 of us. They knew who we were. Detective Williams told me they'd likely been watching us the entire time we were in the building. They'd probably been nearby when we discovered their supplies, and they'd come back to confront us on purpose. To intimidate us. To make sure we wouldn't talk. All 5 men were arrested within a week. They were charged with illegal hunting, poaching endangered species, and several other crimes. During the trial, it came out that they'd been running this operation for years, making hundreds of thousands of dollars. But here's what keeps me up at night. During the investigation, police found one more thing in that basement. A list of names. Most of them were crossed out. The detective wouldn't tell me who the names belonged to or what happened to them. But he did say that several people who'd gone missing in the White Mountains over the past few years had been on that list. They never found any evidence of foul play, so no additional charges were filed, but the implication was clear. Some hikers who discovered that lodge didn't make it back down the mountain. We were lucky. We were lucky that Mike was a forest ranger with radio communication. We were lucky there were 4 of us. We were lucky they let us leave. I still work as a paramedic, and I still do mountain rescue. But I never go into abandoned buildings anymore, no matter how cold it is outside. And whenever I'm up in the White Mountains, I can't help but wonder how many other operations like that are still out there, hidden in forgotten places. The 5 men took plea deals and got between 5 and 10 years in prison. They'll be out eventually, and I know they still have our names and our photos. I moved to a different part of New Hampshire 6 months after the trial. I don't go hiking alone anymore, and I certainly don't go up Tuckerman Trail. Some people say I'm being paranoid, but I remember the way that bearded guy looked at us in the lodge. I remember the way they surrounded us. They wanted us to know we'd seen too much, and they wanted us to be scared enough to keep quiet. I reported it anyway, but I still check my rearview mirror more often than I used to. I still get nervous when I see someone in expensive winter gear on the trail, and sometimes late at night I think about that list of names in the basement. I wonder if our names would have ended up on that list if we hadn't been part of an official rescue team. I wonder what would have happened if it had just been me, alone, who'd stumbled into that lodge. I'm grateful I'll never have to find out. Well, those were tonight's stories. If you enjoyed them, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and let me know in the comments which one got to you the most. I'll see you soon with more stories.